Hello.
Hello.
Hi, I'm Robin, and with me today is Alisha Ruiss, and we're going to be talking about all sorts of things, but we're going to be talking about music, performance, and learning and teaching in the arts, specifically, but not exclusive to, the context of people who are highly sensitive. Thank you, Alisha, for joining me today.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I'm really excited to pick your brain on a couple of these topics. So
I'm excited to have my brain picked.
Perfect. So just a little bit of background. Alisha is actually a multi-talented performer, although at the moment she's working primarily as a vocal artist and teacher in Montreal, Canada. She has appeared in musicals, operettas, Shakespearean plays, and worked as a character voiceover artist for video and computer games. In addition to that, she's a dancer, an enthusiastic swing dancer, and she has song and theater writing credits to her name. So lots of artistic involvement there.
Mm-hmm.
I actually have been taking classes with you. As you know, we started in 2018. And one of the things that I've really appreciated about working with you is how adapted and empathetic you are as a teacher. This is something that I really explicitly looked for. Maybe we'll talk about it more later. But first of all, because I was a little bit nervous about my singing. And second of all, as someone who is highly sensitive and can get a little bit uncomfortable sometimes in technical discussions of art, music, dance. You know, we had a conversation before starting. I said, how do you do with people who are a little bit nervous? And the answers you gave me were very, very reassuring. And it's been great ever since.
I'm glad.
Yeah. So I am excited to talk to you about this because, we've already had a lot of conversations. You identify, if I'm correct, as I do, as a highly sensitive person.
Yes.
Yeah. And so we've had a lot of discussions about what it means to be highly sensitive in the context of music and performance. So I think there's going to be some particularly juicy exchanges for us to get into there.
Sure. Well, in terms of my work as a voice teacher, that's kind of developed slowly over the past, I'd say, 10 years. It's been kind of in fits and starts. There's been times where there's been more students, times when there's less, depending on what I was busy doing. But the thing that I was always most important to me was for people to find freedom in what they do and to have a sense of, I was realizing as I was making a few notes preparing, there's all these opposites that always come into play, both physically with the voice, but also just with our psyche. Like in order to have power, you have to have a great deal of relaxation. In order to have freedom, you have to have a lot of security. So just trying to find a way to get someone to be secure is to have them seek after the freedom, and to also anchor that in their psyche and in their body as like, oh, I can do this, to feel secure in that freedom so that you can deliver when you want, what you want, and if you're dealing with difficult situations, which sometimes for HSPs feels like all the time, that you'll be able to say, okay, I have these tools and security built up in me to at least to fall back on, technically, and also in terms of the talk that I give myself, or the reassurances. So one of the things that I strive to do is just to make people very self-aware, in their process. So I'm not interested as a teacher in just having them sing a sound to me and say, that's good, and them not really register what the good sound is physically or in their mind, because then they will become reliant on me to give them feedback all the time, or to be sure of themselves. And that's, for me, not what's optimal as an artist, because you have so many different environments, so many different, depending on the type of, if you're doing it for fun or you're doing it professionally, you're going to encounter so many different circumstances where you need to adapt. And if there isn't sort of a baseline of both security and freedom, all those things will throw you. They'll throw you anyway, because you're human, but they'll throw you all the more. So I'd say if that was a bit of a rambling overview of my philosophy, or what I hope people lead with, along with, good technique, that would be it, for them to be sure of themselves and be more and more attuned to how they feel when they sing, what they're hearing, but more what they feel physically.
Cool. Yeah, and I, having been through it with you, I can confirm that is what it looked like, that there was a lot of discussions about paying attention to the broader aesthetics, not simply just the technical aspect, but of course anchoring it in good technique. And then with the end goal also being independence or freedom, as you put it, and confidence.
Yeah.
Right? Because it doesn't matter if you have the best voice in the world. If you don't know what you're capable of, you're not going to do anything with it. So
Yeah.
it's very
And I
important
think
as well.
there's a lot of, I would say danger to sound too doomsday-ish, but there's in certain learning environments, especially universities, and I think many friends of mine who are singers could attest to this. Hopefully things are improving now, but there is a sense of, in some programs, either an over-reliance on the teacher or kind of boxed-in mentality that might be disguised as discipline, but it ends up not really being that. It ends up, that someone is, dealing with someone who they feel is controlling, maybe unwittingly, but there's a lot of potential pitfalls for an environment that I think isn't grounded in a sense of wanting the freedom for the artist, and not just as a nice phrase, but as something that really that's actually part of the work. And I think if it's not introduced explicitly, there's some people who automatically kind of get it. Like they are doing, they think that way, they operate that way. But if you go into an institution and you kind of expect, maybe subconsciously, that will be taught to you, and it isn't, and then you find yourself in the middle of a professional environment and suddenly like, oh, these are questions I have to answer and things I have to learn, and I don't know how to begin learning them or how to begin answering those questions. That's a lot of extra pressure that you don't need when you just want to get up and sing. So I really think it's important to have it as an explicit part of the learning when people come to me.
Even just listening to the way you said it, the word respect comes to mind. There's a lot of respect for your student, respect for that person and their own sense of artistry.
Yeah.
And that's, I think, having that affirmation and validation is, for many people, it's going to be very essential to the learning process.
Yeah.
Especially if you're highly sensitive as well, because you're very attuned to what's going on around you.
Yeah, externally and internally. Like, people carry a lot when they come into lessons, not necessarily in a bad way, but they're carrying their day, they're carrying maybe their hopes for that song. If they're preparing an audition, they're carrying fears about not being able to do something, they're carrying joy because it's like a super fun thing they really want to do, and they want to make sure that they can handle it. Like, they carry so much, and so there's a balance between kind of cutting through all of that in an appropriate way to be able to say, like, okay, here's what we can tackle so you can feel secure, and being able to acknowledge that that's a reality, everything that's going on, without kind of heightening it. And it's sort of a juggling thing with every lesson. Sometimes I'm like, okay, if I anticipate your problems, I might make them bigger. If I say, okay, sometimes I can feel it from someone if they're bringing in some sort of anxiety or whatever. So sometimes it's best to sort of not ignore it in the sense that pretend it's not there, but just sort of not acknowledge it in that moment and just let's hone in and focus on something else so that hopefully can dissipate. Or sometimes, when you're in the middle of it, saying like, okay, when you do this, it's probably going to feel like you can't do it. Like, that's probably what's going on in your head, or that's just what went on in your head, right? And often, they'll say, yes, actually, that's what I'm feeling, or that's what I'm worried about. And so sometimes just for them not to have to carry it alone is helpful, and other times it's like fanning flames. So it's really in the moment, like discernment, to be able to say, okay, what's needed right here? Maybe it's to clear all the brush away and focus on one thing, or sometimes it's just to say, like, this is going to feel messy for you. You're going to, sometimes when we're reworking certain aspects of technique, it can feel suddenly that they don't know how to sing because they might have been singing one way for a while, relying on one way, which may not even be a problem, but it might just be limited and they can do so much more. So I'm like, we're going to take it apart or like widen it, and for a while it's going to feel like I don't know how to sing. So to acknowledge that so that they don't feel like, oh, I'm just not getting it. I think can be important.
Yeah. It's an extremely vulnerable process, or it makes you extraordinarily vulnerable to, I mean, first of all, singing is quite a vulnerable art, right?
Yeah.
Just like dance, you're working with your body, you're working with your person, you are kind of fused with your instrument. You can't hide behind, you can't hide behind or something, or the piano, yeah, So already the process is comes with so much vulnerability built in, and then the process of learning or relearning something technical only heightens that. So I hear a lot of empathy and intuitive, reading of the student in your approach.
Yeah.
And I think that can be so beneficial for anybody who's struggling to get into that space or to stay in that space, whether it's just discomfort or all the way up to an actual anxiety. Yeah, it's extraordinarily helpful. Like, I'm thinking of a moment, I think there was a moment where I don't know what we were talking about, some kind of technical thing. There are a couple of breathing techniques that always set me off, that I've often struggled with, or when it comes time to work them, for whatever reason, I feel extra vulnerable about them. And I'll even sometimes just shut down and say, you know what, I want to stop. I don't want to go on. And I do remember there was a moment where that happened in one of our classes, and your response was, well, let's just sing through it together. Let's just try it together. Can I do it with you?
Mm-hmm.
And somehow that worked. That was really, it's so simple. It's so simple. It's not any kind of witchcraft, right? It's just, okay, I'll sing with you, right?
Yeah.
I think it's like you said, just accompanying the person.
Yeah.
And while they're in that moment, in that little crisis moment.
Yeah.
And it was perfect because it allowed me to pass through it to the other side.
Yeah. And I think it's really what became more and more obvious as time went on when I was teaching, was that there really isn't a one size fits all. And that as a teacher for me feels vulnerable sometimes, because a lesson starts and sometimes I get nervous when the students there. I'm like, do I have enough knowledge or wisdom to give them? Am I gonna lead them astray? Or I'm confident that I'm not going to teach somebody to sing with a lot of tension. I feel pretty confident that I'm on the right track with that. But sometimes I'm like, do I have enough to be able to offer them? And yet at the same time, I've become really aware that I can't plot out a lesson from the beginning of when they come. For me, working that way is impossible, because I don't know what they're coming in the room with. I mean, literally, I don't know necessarily the music they're coming in with, but also I don't know how their day was. If it's a lady and they're on their period, or if it's, just been a super hot day, or, they ran a marathon, it could be anything. And so sometimes it is sort of like taking that energy and being like, can I redirect it? And sometimes you do need confrontation to sort of wake someone up if they're, I know I fall into I like the idea of just singing and not thinking about it too much because it's more fun, but sometimes I'll need a teacher to be like, nope, you're being lazy, but sort of pay more attention. But you have to know when someone is ready for that, and that can vary from day to day. And I think, and I'm not sure there's something I wanted to ask you, or maybe it'll be something to look up later. I'd be curious to see what has been said, if anything, about just the notion of interrupting energy, both physical energy and emotional energy, and even just physics, which I don't know anything about, so I'm not going to attempt to talk about. But the whole idea that when something is in motion, to stop it abruptly can feel like a violence. And so even stopping someone in the middle of singing, I sometimes have a hard time. I don't want to do it because I know that they're riding a wave emotionally, or they're maybe getting into their sound. So there's the judging. I'm like, okay, I don't want you to continue with that tension though, so I will stop you. But other times I will wait a little bit longer, because I think going through with that energy is more important than making the correction right then. And also just purely from the point of view that I have been stopped abruptly, and I hate it. I really, really hate it. I've been in coachings where I haven't even really sung for them yet. And I should mention that these are not it's not my regular teachers who I've had, who are wonderful. But I've had coachings where I'll start to sing and I've barely warmed up, or I haven't even sung yet that day, and they're like, nope. And I'm like, okay, wait, no, don't. And that's not me being overly well, maybe it is me being highly sensitive, but it's also a sense of respecting, like, I'm just, like, the way I've mentioned this often at the beginning of lessons, like the way you wake up a baby, you know, like the baby's just like rubbing their eyes and you can't be like, be awake! You would never do that to a child, hopefully, unless you're a monster. So I feel like I think that that's just kind of necessary to be aware of. Like, you know, you do have things to get done, and you don't want to over coddle someone, and you want to get down to business.
Yeah.
But to just recognize that is part of the process. You know, if someone hasn't sung yet today at all, you know, and if it's somebody who's very experienced as well, and they come to you, be like, I haven't sung, but I still feel warm. Let's get right into it. It's like, okay, I trust. You know, I trust the process. So. Yeah. Part of all of that is like there's a lot of philosophy behind it, but part of it is just because I hate it when someone does it to me.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So I love that you asked me the question back. Okay. So in terms of physics, I can't answer. If there are any physicists watching, please send us some info if anything we say resonates with you. There you go. Resonates. Little physics pun. That's the extent of my physics related commentary for you. But okay, I do have two answers for you. The first answer would actually be from the point of view as a teacher myself, right? I teach language, and it's very interesting and cool the amount of overlap that I've noticed between language instruction and other performance instruction, so dance and music. There's a lot of similarities, and at the end of the day, you know, language is performative, right? It's not simply an intellectual exercise. There is that aspect of it in the same way that you could teach music theory purely intellectually. So those things, yeah, you wouldn't be as sensitive in your approach as a teacher. You can kind of just, you know, get it out. But in terms of giving feedback and helping a student develop the actual production aspect of it, that is something that I think requires a certain amount of sensitivity on the part of the teacher. You don't have to be a highly sensitive person, which I will define in a minute, but you just need to be able to read the student right. Mm-hmm. I have used the abrupt style sometimes. I've used it when I felt that it was going to be of a benefit to the student. If I felt that for some reason they weren't taking me seriously, they weren't paying attention, they were overconfident somehow, if I felt I needed to go, okay, no. Right. I felt that they were already, I don't go in like that. I go in and if I see, okay. And I typically even like to wait till we've established a dynamic of like reading each other, presenting each other first. Right. Because you want there to be a certain level of trust, right, before you do that. So I try to read the room a little bit or read the student a little bit. If someone has already told me, you know, teachers talk amongst themselves, if I already know enough about that student to say, okay, they need more of a no-nonsense approach, then okay, sure, you can do that, you know. And then teaching kids and teenagers is another story as well. Often that can be beneficial. But if you're talking about your average student, and especially your student who's maybe a little bit more anxious or a little less experienced or maybe a little bit more sensitive, that kind of person you have to really watch out before you confront them. I'm not saying you can't do it. You actually can. And sometimes if you do it at the right moment, it can be so powerful. But you want to establish that supportive connection first, I would say. And then as you get to know them, and if you can see at some moment like, oh, okay, something is off, and now I have to like, you know, try to push them, you know, but you have to establish a good connection before you can do that.
Yeah, that, and I think I don't know if it just happens to be the mix of people that I've gotten, or I think different environments, like literally city environments. Like being in New York is like a whole different vibe, you know, in terms of competitiveness and stakes and everything. So I might find a need there to be a little bit more forceful. Who knows if I was teaching in that environment.
Yeah.
I can't say I've ever encountered a situation where I really needed to like go hard. Like when people are coming for voice lessons, like most of the time they're excited about creating something, or if they're already creative in some way, or they're already a singer, but they, you know, that they feel kind of insecure, they want to improve. So they're coming with the mindset of a student, like, you know, and they're coming with a certain amount of both insecurity and have to say humility, like even for, you know, like I love my students. I think my students are great, great people, you know, and great singers. And so they don't need to be taken down a peg or two. You know, I feel like when that's a kind of default position in a teacher, it's just like, don't teach. Like especially not artists. That's just like I feel really strongly about that.
Yeah.
And I've heard stories, I've heard stories of people being told, oh well, the thing is it's just like you can't really sing. I had someone say, and I was like,
yeah.
All my mama bear instincts, I'm just like, who is that? Who is that? So I never work with, and at the same time trying to be diplomatic, and the fact that people do have different strengths. There's some people who need to be told, like, you have to stop being so overconfident. You're constantly out of tune. You need to work, But that's generally not what I have encountered. So I don't even really consider it a concern.
Right, exactly. Especially someone who's, willingly signing up for a course, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
So the other part of my answer, one that's a little bit more specific to highly sensitive people, or HSPs. I mean, I don't want to get too much into the details. I will post a link referring people to the definition of a highly sensitive person. But very briefly, this is a trait, a character trait that has been studied primarily by a researcher called Elaine Aron, though now it's getting more widely researched by others as well. And she wants to argue that this is really its own distinct trait. It's not introversion, it's not shyness or anxiety or anything like that. It's a character trait that you can observe quite early on in a child's development, suggesting that there is some innate or inborn element to it, although I'm sure the environment does affect people's level of sensitivity as well. I mean, she's even seen it in animals, right? Animal researchers notice that, like, if you look at a group of monkeys, there's some that are more susceptible to their environment than others. So the main thing about, like, what is it? It's about susceptibility to your environment. And it seems to pass through depth of processing. So it seems to be that individuals who identify as highly sensitive are taking in more information from their surroundings and then kind of cognitively processing them more. They do find differences in the brain activities in particular regions between highly sensitives and, I guess, the rest of the population. I mean, and it also goes without saying that sensitivity is a general human trait. Every person, with some exceptions, everyone has a certain level of sensitivity, right? There is a questionnaire that you can take, and if you check off a certain number of items, you're considered a highly sensitive person. But even if you don't meet that threshold, you can be someone whose sensitivity is pretty well developed, right? And the way it often manifests itself is in things like we were saying, empathy, adapting to others, understanding others' emotions, also noticing details, being quite conscientious, and being very affected by stimuli in the environment, right? So noises, crowds, lights, fabrics, right? It also means being more affected by things like the arts, right? For people who do identify as highly sensitive, we're talking about like the top 15 to 30% of people who are really at the extreme end of that scale. And when you get up there, it's not a disorder, certainly not a disorder. It's a neutral trait, but it does look qualitatively different. People who are that highly sensitive throughout their lives, people are going to comment on it. People are going to say, oh, you're really sensitive, or you're quite emotional, you care a lot. Why do you notice everything? Why do you think about everything? These are some of the ways. It often comes out negatively, especially in our culture.
Yeah.
But it has very many positive traits, like, oh, you care a lot. Oh, you're a great listener. Oh, you're so understanding. Oh, you're so careful. You're so thoughtful. You're so diligent, right? Like these are the positive aspects of it. And she kind of finds there's like subscales, sub factors within it. And one of them is aesthetic sensitivity. Mm-hmm. Okay. So it's actually, if you look at that little self-assessment, there are a couple of items that specifically talk about this. So for example, one of the things that you can check off is, I am deeply moved by the arts or music. You'll notice that music, for whatever reason, stands out above the other arts. I'm not sure why. The other item on the list is, I notice and enjoy delicate or fine sense, taste, sounds, and works of art. So we haven't done research specifically validating the connection between HSPs and music, responsiveness to music, but I'll get into it in a moment. What I wanted to say, again, about feedback and corrections and interacting with highly sensitive students, it is a little bit different than dealing with people who are less sensitive. And I love this example that Elaine Aron gives in one of her books, which her analogy comes from her experience in training dogs.
Okay.
And she has this story where she talks about a beagle that she was training. And the beagle was not particularly sensitive, kind of going along, doing its own thing. And she would correct the beagle, very harshly. Well, okay, maybe it would get it. Maybe it wouldn't. Maybe it would get it, right? And she'd have to correct it quite harshly. And even if she corrected it harshly, the beagle would kind of be fine and go off and do its little beagly thing.
Yeah.
And then she got a border collie. I don't know if as a species they're more sensitive, but this one was much more sensitive because she went to give the normal kind of correction to the collie, and the poor thing just started whimpering. I was like, oh my God, like, what did I do? What did I do? And then she said, oh, what did I do? And she realized that the border collie was so attentive, so already attuned to what she was going to do, and was already ready, anticipating a feedback from her, that it was just overkill for her to give the kind of correction that she gave to the beagle. So when you think in terms of highly sensitive students, it's not that you shouldn't be correcting them. Absolutely, you have to be giving them that feedback. It's vital. But often a subtle approach is best. A little goes a long way.
Yeah.
Often they're already trying to read you as a teacher. They're trying to see how is she going to react. So they're noticing, oh, your face did this, or, oh, your tone of voice did that. So you don't have to hit them over the head with it. Like, even a small comment is going to be enough to stick.
Yeah, there is a strange, not a strange dynamic, but there is a dynamic of the fact that students always can be watching you to see what your face does, and then they're not really with themselves. So sometimes, I've done this with you, I'm sure, where I'll say, okay, I'm not here right now, or go sing to the wall or sing over my head, because it's always just plain weird. Like, even if it's like your life partner, to sing looking into someone's eyes, like that happens in the movies and in musicals, and that's why we love them, but it's very strange to sing for one person, in terms of actually looking at them and connecting while you're also connecting with your piece. The people who do it well, that's why they're geniuses, and then we don't realize till we get up to try to do it. Like, Judy Garland was a genius at this. Just look at how she connects with her audience. She's like so there with them. She's like no fear about that vulnerability. There's no guile there, and that's it's really hard. So I try to acknowledge that in the lessons too, to just say it's weird to sing for one person, So be it with your own self. I'm going to be here like in my listening group, even though I'm right next to you, and then we'll like connect after, or just pretend. And that actually is in terms of practice. It takes a long time to even feel comfortable making noise, daring to make noise loudly, and to take as much space as you need to take in order to get used to your full instrument. And I remember so many auditions where oftentimes the other things about auditions is there's someone in the room and you have to be quiet, you can't be warming up, so you have to warm up before you get home. Or maybe it's really early in the morning, you don't want to bother the neighbors, so there's all those, practical, logistical things. And sometimes even if you do have a place that you can warm up, you've got, 10, 12, 20 other people warming up at the same time. It becomes this like competitive, weird, I don't want to sing over them, I don't want to look like I'm competing, bizarre thing, and it takes a while to just become comfortable with the fact it's just like, this is what I need to do to prepare. So I'm going to do that now, and it's not about who's listening or why or what they think of me. I just have to do it to prepare. And for that to become stronger than all the other input, and to keep practicing it is that. I remember the first time I really remember it was when I went for my audition at McGill. And they give you a practice room, you can go in, and all down the hall, even though they're supposedly soundproof, I could hear all these huge, really developed voices. And there's this sense of like, what am I doing here? I shouldn't be here. I don't sound like that, or like, can I also make noise? Can I also sing here? Like, is it okay? Am I bothering anyone? So that's kind of a whole phenomenon. And something else I wanted to touch on what you said about HSPs, being sensitive or being told that they're sensitive. I feel like I have, and I don't know if you feel this too, but there's a shadow side to that, which is because I notice a lot of different things in certain areas, I can be incredibly, I would say, insensitive or frustrated if somebody else doesn't.
Yeah.
So suddenly,
oh yeah,
Not only am I bothered by the fact that, someone the other day, like it was past 10:30 at night and there were kids outside screaming, but screaming really like they were dying. And it was really just like, rah, and there were clearly adults with them, and the adults weren't like, there might be people sleeping, like it's not 6 o'clock at night.
Yeah.
I had to go out in my pajamas and just be like, could you please ask your kids not to scream? And I'm like, I worked with kids. I love kids. I want them to feel free to make noise, but there's a time and a place. And I just felt not only annoyed by the noise, but then I was annoyed by myself and my own annoyance. And I'm just like, I'm so mean. I've turned into like the old crotchety neighbor lady.
No.
And that's the thing too, where suddenly people can have a strong reaction to something. And I imagine, and I think you've had more aware of this for a longer time, like to even put a name to it as HSP. Like I've kind of come to know it through you in a way, where you can say, no, like this is partly how I'm made up, and not to like wrap yourself over the head about it. But I still have a little bit of that. I'm like, why does this drive me crazy? Like I wish it didn't, but it does.
Yeah.
Maybe you can talk about that.
Oh yeah,
whether in
absolutely. And I mean, no matter how much understanding you have, you're always going to have that visceral reaction. Right? For me, it can be noise. It can also be. I live on a main street, and there's people dumping their garbage and littering all the time, and it just I'm like, don't they know people live here? Come on, I don't want to look at your litter, right? So that's always going to be there a little bit. But I do think the more that you understand about your own level of sensitivity, the more it helps, because first of all, you understand like, all right, I'm not making this up. I'm not being difficult. It's something that's going on, right? And then you can kind of check. You say, okay, I know this is real for me. I'm not going to doubt it or question myself. I know it's real for me. Then you can kind of look around and say like, look, is this something that I can just very easily, and without much of a cost to me, can I just leave, right? Like if you were in the park, could you go to the other side of the park? All right, it's minorly unfair, but it's not a big deal, right? If you go out when there's a soccer game, that's also like, well, you agree to go when there's a soccer game, and, you have a certain responsibility to deal with it yourself, right? But, clearly these are people who are not supposed to be there at a time where it's understood you're supposed to be respectful of other people's tolerance for noise. Yeah. And even if other people didn't complain, you still have a right to say, hey, I live here and this is a problem for me. And the other thing that does help, it doesn't completely solve the issue, but it does help when you acknowledge that you're at that upper end of the scale. You understand that people are not necessarily being jerks when they tolerate and produce a higher volume of sound than you would, or whatever stimulus than you would, right? It just literally doesn't affect them the same way. Maybe they're not, highly sensitive people are in the minority, so maybe they don't have a bunch of people, and it's not the norm in our culture, so maybe they're not surrounded by people who are like that. So sometimes it's just out of, just not knowing that that's how some people are, or how it affects others. So, it sometimes it feels unfair, because it's like, well, all right, why does it fall on me to let people know about this, right? But for the moment, that's what it is. For the moment, that's why we're doing this. That's why we speak up. That's why we try to gently inform people, hey, I'm here and I hear you louder than everyone else does. So please take care.
And also, I have over time, like unrelated to music, but I have been able to reframe, because I think we do absorb a lot of messaging about, oh, you're so sensitive. It usually is, or I'd say often, it's like too sensitive. And my response kind of was like, too sensitive for what? I was like, is there a meter that I'm not supposed to go past in this world? What is too sensitive for what? It's like, because most of the time you're too sensitive for that person to deal with in that moment. I find, that's often the thing. It's like, I don't want to deal with the level of emotions that you have or response that you have right now. So blah, blah. And so that is a part I've been able to own and sort of say, and I think if I was bringing it back to music practice, thinking about the things that you need as prep, talking, let's say, more in the professional world now, like whether it's prep for a rehearsal or prep for a performance or an audition. And I can't say I always respect this, but every time that I come up with whether I have respected it or not, I definitely have strong feelings and thoughts about it, is what is the way to be kind to yourself as a person with those sensitivities going into a situation, as opposed to like, oh, I need all this, and you just feel like, oh, I just feel like I'm this bundle of needs, you know, just like, okay, yeah, but I do, you know, and it's kind to myself when I have put all my audition clothes out the night before and packed the bag, and I'm not, you know, printing my like resume at the last minute. I mean, I never actually do any of those things, right? But I'm just saying, you know, like when I do take time to, let's say, do those things, or even when I was getting ready for our conversation today, it's probably like I haven't been wearing a lot of makeup during quarantine, and I was putting on lipstick, and I was like, just had a kind of flashback to the times I've gotten ready in the dressing room and stuff like that for a show. And usually, like, the lipstick's the last thing, because I'm usually drinking tons of water. So right. Just that gesture of lipstick is kind of like, okay, as well as the warm up and stuff like that, that there becomes an order. And it became really important to me when I did Cabaret, because the makeup was incredibly specific. And it was a wonderful show, but there was a lot about it that was stressful. The role was kind of high stakes as well.
Yeah, you were Sally Bowles, right?
Yes, yeah. And so there was a lot about it that was high stakes from a point of view of the role, has a lot of emotion. And literally, I always thought like if there was a kind of physical aspect of the stress too, was that my entrance was at the top of a very winding staircase with a grate that my shoes could get caught in. So, and I always had trouble like kind of breathing before. I would feel nauseous, and I would have this intense, like I don't think I've ever had the same kind of stage fright as I did with that, where I was like, I can't breathe and I don't know if I can do it. It would be almost before every show, and I would have to walk up this staircase, and I was alone. There was no one else on that part of the stage, and it was sheer terror before coming out. It would have been 10 times worse if I hadn't put my makeup on in a certain order, if I hadn't like prayed, if I hadn't, you know, like I wore the same, I had like a kind of nightie, like I don't know how to call it, like it's like lingerie, but it's like a teddy,
like a slip,
like a slip, and I would get dressed in that because it made me feel like Sally, just like the fabric made me feel like her, and also because it was really hot in there, so it was nice without me being just like in my underwear. So and just that whole process I came to see as a way of loving myself and honoring the process. And even though, you know, I've seen some people that don't need it, you know, like they will arrive at the theater, they take a drink of water, get in their costume, boom, they go on stage. Like, it's like there's no separation between the like real world, so to speak, and going on. And I've known other people who absolutely need like space, you know, and I'm the latter. I don't really like, depending on where I am in the show and when I'm doing the show, sometimes I do need to goof off, and I do need that as well. But generally, most of the time, like my preference is like, okay, I want to do things in a specific order. And if I'm all ready to go, then great, I'll have fun with my castmates. But at least until that first moment comes up. And so now to kind of reframe those things as like, you're honoring yourself as an artist. You're being kind to yourself as an artist. You're respecting your craft when you do all these things, instead of being like, I seem to like require so much. And I think that that's helped a lot. And even when I don't, you know, like when I fall short of that ideal, it's just a reminder. It's just like, no, you really need those things, Alisha, and your talent deserves better than that if you do it that way, you know. And so, because I think that's a kind of heaviness that can be carried, the fact that you're just like, I'm an artist, I want things to work so bad, plus I'm highly sensitive, you know. Yep. Plus, there are mean people in the world and people who leave garbage on the streets, you know, and so it just becomes this whole thing, and you're just like, you know. So when you can at least provide some sort of order for yourself, whatever that looks like, instead of framing it as a sort of like, because sometimes it can sound like the words nitpicky come to mind, or
fussy,
yeah, this negative, like, oh, I just need everything in my place, and then you feel a sort of sense of shame about it, like, oh, I just have to have everything in place. And then sometimes I'm like, oh, but no, I'm actually pretty messy in a lot of ways. Like, things do get thrown all over the place, but there are order in certain areas that allow me to be free, allow me to have security and freedom.
Yeah, like you're saying, it's one of the ironies. One of the many criticisms that get leveled at highly sensitive people is that they're very controlling.
Mm.
But you'll notice, I mean, based on everything you've just told us about your approach to students, you're quite the opposite. You're anything but controlling when it comes to other people. And I think it's a very specific kind of control. We're trying to control our level of stimulation because we know that we can reach that threshold sooner than anybody else. Everyone can be overstimulated. And because we're taking in so much, we just get there faster. And we know, I mean, managing your performance, whenever the performance is all about staying in that sweet spot of proper stimulation. You don't want to be, you know, lethargic, and you don't want to be overly stimulated. You want to be right in the zone.
Yeah.
And I think you're right. I think it's absolutely wonderful. And for some people, it just happens to also be essential to build a routine that allows them to manage the stimulation. But I think also anyone who's around kids, you know, knows that routines and kids go together, right? It's kind of similar, right? Like I think people often compare their artistic selves to children, right? Because you have to have that openness, that spontaneity, that playfulness, right? You're not stuck in here. You're responding in the moment the way a child would, right?
Yeah.
And I'm sure anyone, any teacher or parent or caretaker of a child has seen that, you know, when you have routines, the level of stimulation of the child like just works better, right? Like if there's a day where they miss, I don't know, they just take their bath at the wrong time, they eat at the wrong time, you're going to see the consequences. And again, some not all children, some are more sensitive than others to that, but you'll see, oh, okay, a little bit later, they're extra, I don't know, extra cranky, they're crying more, they're having more meltdowns or something like that, right? So
yeah. And it's also handling all the essential things so that you have I would say, the right kind of availability to the people we're working with. Because like I kind of described a solo environment. Like, I mean, not that I was solo as Sally Bowles, but that first moment I was coming out on stage was alone, you know. But the more I feel, the more you can have a healthy, I would say, explicit approach to knowing. I feel I got a taste of it in my first year of theater school, actually, but I wasn't grown up enough to really get that that's what they were after. I had a voice teacher who, just voice for the actor, not singer, he would ask me how I thought I was doing. And I didn't comprehend. I was like, what do you mean? You're supposed to tell me how I'm doing, you know? And I'm so thankful for that now, because it gave me just a little bit of light so that when I came into classical environment, which was more conditioning about what your teacher thought. Thankfully, I actually had quite a kind and open teacher, but that was kind of the atmosphere I was swimming in, was that there was already a tiny bit of voice that was saying, you also have to figure out. And it was only like, it was tiny then. It was just like a flicker, and then it eventually grew. And I think that explicitly allows you to be open, because then you're not on stage dealing with your own whirlwind of crap, which is going to ensure that you're going to be acting alone, you know, that you're going to be, it's not that nothing will go through, but it's just like the channel is not as clear. And this is a little bit away from music, but I did a little bit of Meisner training, which is a kind of acting training based on Sanford Meisner. I went to the Neighborhood Playhouse for just a summer. I did a summer program, and I also took classes here with Jackie McClintock, who's now passed away. And part of the technique is that your partner is always more important than you. Your partner is the most interesting thing in the room. So if you're stuck in your head and you're stuck on your own stuff, you can't be available to them, and you can't take them in. And that has been one of the most helpful things in life in general. It's been one of the most useful things for being on stage. But I think what ends up happening is that if you don't address to someone who is very intellectual or sensitive, who goes into that type of training, because what they want is they want a reactive person. They don't necessarily want, I would say, they don't want a thoughtful person, but they don't want thought and analysis to be the first thing that comes in front of a moment in acting. That's for work outside. But I think if it gets disparaged, if it doesn't get acknowledged as like part of a process that needs to happen elsewhere, you start to think, oh, I'm too much in my head, I shouldn't be thoughtful, I shouldn't be smart, I should just be like, you know, this reactive kind of machine. And like, that's not the point, you know. I had a good article that a friend wrote, Emily Snyder, for HowlRound about the struggle of being an intelligent person in theater, especially an intelligent woman in theater. You know, someone will sort of say to you, oh, you know, like, you're a great singer, but, or you're this, but you just, you're so smart, but it's not a compliment. It's like it's something that gets in the way of your performance. And while that can be true in terms of like if you're using it at the wrong moment, or if a certain result is expected of you, but if you don't handle that as a teacher, if you don't say like, okay, all this thoughtful stuff, I acknowledge that that's part of you, all this sensitivity, I acknowledge is part of you, and so here's how to make it part of your process so someone doesn't treat it like a liability, or you know when it gets treated like a liability in a performance space or an audition space, that in your mind you can do, okay, I know what they're after, I know how to reroute all this, or I know where to put it kind of in my body for now so that it's not in the way. That way you're not like, oh God, I'm a failure. You know, like it takes like a lot of kind of mental gymnastics if you're learning that on the job or in the moment, like in the audition.
Yeah.
So like, what do I have to do differently to not think, I think all the time, you know? So instead to say, okay, well, how can I employ that to my advantage? How is my sensitivity my superpower, you know, and how can I put that all at the service of everything I do, and then have this availability? And yeah, I think there's a lack of acknowledgement that that's a thing sometimes. Yeah. Surprisingly, it shouldn't be, but
well, because I think you're right. The ultimate goal, I think, that people are after when they say, you know, your partner is the most important, the audience is the most important. The ultimate goal is that you are available and present.
Yeah, exactly.
Everyone has to manage that, but I think you're right that people who are highly sensitive have to manage that a little bit differently, and they have to manage it by passing through what is going on for them. They almost have to be selfish. And I find them in my own life, whether it's artistically or any other thing that I'm doing, if I fail to pay attention to what's really going on for me, that's when I actually become the most difficult to be around, most overwhelmed. I'm thinking of a moment, I remember this, I'm thinking of a moment that one of my boyfriends wanted to surprise me for my birthday. And he was saying, okay, meet me at this place, right? He said, oh, pack an overnight bag. And I was like, oh, I have to get ready last minute. And I was stressed. And like, anyone who knows me knows that a way to stress me is to rush me. So, you know, I was kind of stressed and I was in this bad mood. And then I felt bad because I didn't want to let him down. I knew he was doing and when I got to the place that we were meeting, and it was just a few moments before, just a second before, I had this thought, and I was like, you know, what if like the best thing of my life were about to happen? I didn't have a specific idea, but like, what if this were about to be one of the most memorable moments of my life, and I'm not mentally free for that?
Yeah.
What a disaster, right? So it is my responsibility to be able to manage my own stimulation. And sometimes, ironically, that requires spending more time and attention on yourself, but not as an end goal, as the end goal to be available for others, to be available for your art.
Yeah.
I think if I had to put a label on it, I would say what, in the context of art, what is probably very helpful for HSPs is creative independence, developing creative independence. I noticed that not only in music with you, but also in dance, and also this one time that I took a theater class, what I really appreciated the most is teachers who would say, how did that feel for you? You know, and even one teacher in the theater class who would make an explicit point of saying, okay, you, what did you experience? Okay, now you, what did you experience? See how different their experiences were?
Yeah.
And really emphasizing that point that, okay, what I'm doing and what's passing through me actually is important to the craft, and I can use that. So
I would also hope that this would be like, if I was in charge of the world, if I was in charge of all arts education, I would say that's a challenge I'd want to issue to various types of teachers to just examine. It's like a dangerous step to get down, but I can say that I can't say that generally, but I can say that I have had more negative experiences with male teachers than with female teachers. And so I don't know what to make of that. I don't know if it's style, and it's certainly not every, my musical theater writing class, it's a male teacher, it's Jonathan Monroe, he's wonderful. So just in case he listens.
And I mean, two of the teachers I was thinking of are actually men. So
yeah.
I don't think there's anything inherent. I think if anything, it would be, how are you educated?
Yeah.
How are you trained? And it would have been also, how are you socialized?
Yeah.
into this role
Yeah.
as a man or a woman, which is evolving
Yeah.
in the current era, which is really cool.
Yeah.
But especially, and this is another big topic we're not going to talk about, but
Yeah.
especially the connection between masculinity and sensitivity being
Yeah.
something that's very discouraged in our culture.
Yeah.
It would make sense that at least for a certain generation, for a certain era, it would have been a more awkward fit if you're a highly sensitive woman working with a not so sensitive man.
Right.
Who's been told he's not allowed to be sensitive.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's a whole thing about who is inclined to want to take leadership roles, why.
Right.
Sometimes they're very...
Exactly.
So I think my challenge would be for people to know themselves and know like their faults and know their weaknesses, or just go looking for them like as a pedagogue and say, well, what are my potential blind spots? And I feel like there's definitely more freedom to in a certain sense to invest in that as an artist than if you're, let's say, a teacher of a general classroom where it's super stressful and you have like 30 different personalities at once and you're trying like, both my parents were elementary school teachers. I don't think I could do it with that group of people. I love kids, but it's so much to take in. I think they're all, I think the majority of them are incredible geniuses, and I'm so grateful. I'm grateful for your service, teachers. It's so funny because you see that in the news where people will thank the army or police, thank you for your service. I always feel like I want to say that to teachers.
Yeah. And I think we can point out too that a lot of what we're saying now isn't probably not realizable in the context of a large group.
Yes, exactly.
Maybe the general philosophy, because like in that art class, I think we were at least 20 people, the theater class. So you can have it as a general philosophy to encourage people to develop their creative independence. Yeah. But in terms of like adapting to students one-on-one, reading them carefully, you need a private or small group class for that.
Yeah. Definitely. And you also have to have, there's classes where you're helping develop the artist, helping develop artistry, and then there's classes where it's just like, okay, this is about getting the job. And it is true that there's two different, aspects there, that how you come into a room. I had a teacher who had said to, some of us, she worked both in the States and here, she's like, Canadians, your Canadianness, like it's a stereotype, but your humility in general, it doesn't serve you in the audition room. Like there's a certain even if you come in with it, and I've noticed it, like even if I'm not actually apologizing, there's more of a sense of deference. People who know me are also gonna be like, that's a lie. No, it's not. There's a lot of circumstances where if I really notice someone else's expertise, I'm not saying I always notice it, but if I do, I will tend to defer to them. And part of it is a respect thing. If it's something I feel really strongly about, yes, I will fight tooth and nail for it. But there's other times where I won't necessarily push to have space, because a lot of times I'm not that interested in having space. Like if not much is at stake, I will sort of be like, look, I don't need to take up space here. And if that's a regular way of life, that can be quite helpful to get through certain parts of life, but it's not helpful in the audition room. So it is I wish if there was more emotional intelligence employed in a practical way in teaching about tackling your artistry, how you enter a room, how you enter a space, how you, and some of that can be kind of you do in your own in therapy or your own reflection, or if you're a person of prayer, like there's also a whole spiritual battle going on there. But aside from that, I think just giving people questions to think about. When you go into a room, what do you think about? Here's things to consider when you enter a rehearsal room. And now we have the internet with like the top 10 things to think about when you go to rehearsal. Like those kind of exist, like in a way that. But I think too, there's a difference between them existing somewhere as information to be absorbed versus something that's imparted to someone as a gift, and is done relationally is whole different, because the way it will stay with you, the way a teacher spoke to you versus the top 10 list you read and then you forgot because you watched a YouTube video, So anyway, that's my I think we'll end with just that little funny place to put it, but that little research tidbit that I wanted to share. But it's interesting because you said, we're emphasizing the social connection, right? Mm-hmm. And I think that's something that
that is critical in artistic education and teaching for highly sensitive people. Probably for everyone, but especially for highly sensitive people. And the reason I'm thinking of this thing that I read is because a study was done, not specifically on people who identify as highly sensitive, but people who score high on the trait of empathy, which is something that has been established as very present in HSPs. And apparently, when people who score high on empathy listen to music, they have a different response, even just at the neurological level, right? They put them in a brain scan and they say, oh, okay, there's areas of your brain that are more active than the average person. And this includes areas that are responsible for analyzing and understanding other people's behavior and social processing, basically, right? So like the prefrontal cortex, the temporoparietal area. These are areas that are involved in social processing. So when highly sensitive, empathetic people are listening to music, there's something almost social about it.
Yeah.
So it would be weird to be in that context. You're listening to music, you've got this like sense of connectedness, right? And then all of a sudden your teacher's being very antisocial with you. It is a bit jarring, and it's hard to stay in that flow. And if you can be in a context that's more supportive, again, it's not about being overly fused, right? Because the other polarity of that is developing your creative independence. But I think like keeping in mind that this sense of connectedness is super important. I mean, even just to the level of how we process things in our brains for everyone, but especially for highly sensitive people. I think I think it kind of reinforces some of what we've been talking about.
Yeah, and I think it also brings to light the fact that when you're working on music, you know, it sounds like a cliche thing to say, like, well, you're working from a place of the heart or your soul, you know, or like an inner part of your being. Like that's literally to the degree of brain, you know, like what's happening in terms of your brain activity, so that when something does affect you very deeply, it's not that it's all in your head in the sense that it's something you made up. It's just like, well, yes, it's literally happening like on a physiological level. And to me, hopefully, if that's coming out in an expressive way that makes sense, that's something that, to me, that points to integration. You know, somebody who has integrity, not just in the terms of like if they're an honest person, but integration, like of your physical and mental and spiritual being. I'm like, that's what we need for like good leadership. That's what we need for service. That's what we need for community. And so that's, I think, what artists feel sometimes when, you know, there was this whole thing about who's an essential worker, and artists fell on the bottom of the scale, you know, like, and I mean, I understand what they're talking about in terms of certain pragmatic things, but I'm like, what does society look like if we don't have people that are integrally linked, you know, to meaning and to each other? Like, how does society then get built or rebuilt when there's a problem like a pandemic? You know, I wouldn't want artists in charge of everything, but sometimes I would want them in charge of everything, because we're good at building something out of nothing and also beginning from like the truest place that we know. And even as we struggle to figure out what that is, there's also a sense that it's you know, it's cliche to say we do it because we love it. We want to be paid well. Yeah. We want to be treated well for our work. Yeah. But there is a sense of need that isn't sort of just a psychological dependence, but it's actually coming from the truest place of a human being, I guess. You know, it's not just like, oh, we need to do it because, you know, the way I need coffee in the morning to wake up. It's like, no, it's coming from a need that at its core is like the most profoundly human. And to just kind of dismiss that as something that's just like, oh, it's something you really like or something you're really sensitive to, I feel misses a lot of the point. And so I would invite people to, you know, try to enter into those experiences as much as possible too, and learn to listen in a different way. And that could, I guess, be a whole other podcast, how to listen as an HSP listens.
Oh boy. All right. Well, we'll wrap this one up here. Okay. Yes. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
We really had a lot to talk about, and more, maybe forthcoming in a future episode. Sure. Alisha, where can we find you on the internet?
Oh, yes. So my website is www.alisharuiss.com. I have a fan page, so if you type in Alisha Ruiss fan page on Facebook. I've been less active on those recently. I'm also on Instagram, which is linked, I think, to my Facebook. If you want to find the most performance-related stuff, my YouTube channel is Swing Siren on YouTube, and you can find performances there. If you want to get in touch with me for lessons, you can just email me, and yeah, happy to meet you.
All right. Well, thanks very much.
Thank you.